welcome back to our channel. Got a 1985, 1990, 1999, or 2000 penny? Don't spend it without checking first. Some of these Lincoln cents have rare mint errors and valuable varieties that can be worth far more than 1 cent. Like and subscribe, you could be holding a small coin with a big value. In 1985, the Lincoln cent entered its 76th year of production, still bearing the familiar profile of Abraham Lincoln on the obverse and the Lincoln Memorial on the reverse. The coin was a constant in American life, the kind of thing that passed through millions of hands without a second thought. The United States Mint, operating at full capacity to meet demand, produced over 5 billion pennies that year between its Philadelphia and Denver facilities. Yet within that immense production run, a quiet mistake emerged, subtle enough to evade detection at first, yet dramatic enough to make a handful of coins unlike any others in circulation. It wasn't until years later that one of these peculiar pieces found its way into the hands of a collector. He had been searching through old change jars, the kind of metal-heavy glass containers many people let sit untouched for decades, gathering dust. There was nothing unusual about his evening ritual: pour out the coins, sift through each one, set aside anything that seemed odd, and move on. For him it was less a hobby and more a meditation. Most nights yielded nothing but the occasional wheat cent or a bright uncirculated copper piece. But that night, something about one coin stopped him mid-motion. It was a 1985 cent, copper-plated zinc, showing a surprising amount of luster for its age. But when he turned it over to inspect the reverse, his practiced eyes immediately caught something amiss. The Lincoln Memorial, which should have stood in crisp relief, looked blurred, almost ghostly. Columns that should have been sharp were faint and partially missing. Parts of the step seemed to fade into the field of the coin, and the tiny initials, FG, for designer Frank Gasparo, were so weak they were barely visible. His heart began to pound as he reached for his loupe. Magnified, the strange details became unmistakable. This wasn't damage caused by wear or mishandling. The fields were smooth, with no sign of abrasion, yet the design lacked definition in places it shouldn't. It dawned on him what he was seeing: an overpolished die strike. The mint, in an attempt to maintain production, had overzealously polished a worn die, stripping away fine details before continuing to strike coins. The collector placed the coin aside carefully and continued to comb through the jar, though his mind kept drifting back to that odd penny. It felt different, special, even though he couldn't yet say why. Over the following days, he scoured his reference books and online archives for any mention of similar errors. Few examples came up, and even those weren't identical. His curiosity only deepened. Eventually, he posted clear photos of the coin on a collector's forum, hoping for insight. The replies trickled in slowly at first, then faster as word spread. Most agreed, this was no post-mint damage and no minor anomaly. A few pointed out that while die polishing errors were known from other years, they were extraordinarily hard to find in 1985 issues, making this particular example a significant discovery. One veteran member even remarked he'd been searching for decades without finding one. The collector sent the coin off to a grading service, packaging it with the utmost care. As the weeks passed, he kept checking the tracking number, unable to stop thinking about what the graders might say. When the slab finally arrived, his breath caught as he read the label through the plastic: 1985 Lincoln cent, reverse die overpolished, missing design elements, MS condition. The confirmation sent a thrill through him unlike anything he'd felt in his years of collecting. He held the slabbed coin under his lamp that night, turning it over slowly, watching the light dance over the fields and the softly vanished lines of the memorial. It was an unassuming little piece of history, yet it spoke volumes about how even in the age of machines and mass production, human error and haste could create something unique. Word of his find began to spread beyond the forums. A dealer at a local show recognized him and asked if he'd consider selling. Another collector sent him a long email offering several thousand for it outright. But he held on to it, at least for now. The offers kept climbing over the next months, reflecting the market's growing fascination with rare modern errors. He watched as the story of the coin's unusual strike became more widely known in collector circles. Other examples slowly surfaced, only a few, and none quite as clean as his own. The scarcity seemed to cement its place among sought-after modern rarities. Each discovery only increased demand, and auction houses began listing similar coins with rising estimates, fueling even greater interest. When he finally decided the time was right, he placed it up for auction himself. The buzz surrounding the lot was immediate, drawing attention from bidders who might once have ignored a common Lincoln cent but now recognized a mistake this pronounced and rare as something far more valuable. As the auctioneer's voice echoed through the room, the numbers climbed steadily, each bid a testament to the strange journey of a penny that should have been ordinary but wasn't. The final hammer came down on a price range he'd never imagined when he first fished it from that dusty jar: $44,000 to $122,000. The year 1990 marked yet another chapter in the long history of the Lincoln cent, which had already been in production for more than 8 decades. Still featuring the dignified profile of Abraham Lincoln on the obverse and the Lincoln Memorial on the reverse, the penny was an unassuming piece of everyday life. That year, the United States Mint churned out billions of 1-cent coins from its facilities in Philadelphia and Denver, their presses striking away tirelessly to meet the country's endless demand for change. Within such massive output, no one suspected that a small, subtle mistake could slip by unnoticed, yet it did. And it lay hidden for years, carried from pocket to pocket, its secret unknown to all who spent it. It wasn't until much later that one sharp-eyed collector stumbled upon the anomaly. He had a habit of stopping by estate sales and flea markets, scanning tables piled high with forgotten odds and ends. At one such sale, he noticed an old coffee can filled to the brim with pennies, advertised for just a few dollars. Something about it called to him, and he bought it on a whim, carrying the heavy can home that same afternoon. That evening, he poured the pennies out onto his kitchen table and began the quiet ritual of examination. At first, he worked by habit alone, flipping coin after coin in the light, stacking the common dates and setting aside a few decent-looking wheat cents. But then one coin caught his attention. A 1990 Lincoln cent, bright copper red despite its age, seemed to almost shine more brightly than the rest. He picked it up, curious, and flipped it over to examine the memorial. At first glance, nothing seemed too strange. But then his trained eye noticed something peculiar. The details of the reverse didn't look quite right. The fine lines of the memorial steps were soft, nearly vanished in places. The pillars appeared faint, and the designer's tiny FG initials were faint and incomplete. It wasn't a result of wear, there were no scratches or gouges. Instead, it looked as if the die itself had somehow failed to strike the details fully. He squinted closer, holding the coin under a magnifier. That was when the pieces fell into place. What he held in his hand was a rare and dramatic example of an overpolished die error. The Mint, in its haste to keep up with production, had overpolished a worn die, grinding away some of the fine details of the design before continuing to use it to strike more coins. This one had slipped through quality control unnoticed, entering circulation as just another penny. The collector felt a rush of excitement course through him. He set the coin aside carefully, afraid to even breathe too hard on it. Then he grabbed his reference books and started to dig through old auction records and error coin catalogs. A few scattered mentions of similar errors surfaced, Lincoln cents missing memorial details due to overpolished dies, but he found almost nothing specific to the 1990 issue. His pulse quickened. Still unsure of just how rare his find might be, he posted clear photos of the coin to an online collector forum he frequented. The responses came slowly at first, then faster as others took notice. A few skeptical comments were quickly drowned out by more knowledgeable voices. One longtime collector replied that he'd seen only one other example in decades of searching. Another noted that 1990 was notorious for high production numbers, which made it even less likely for such an error to survive without being caught. Encouraged, he decided to send the coin to a professional grading service. Those weeks of waiting stretched on endlessly as he checked his mailbox daily, hoping for word. When the package finally arrived, he tore it open with trembling hands and peered at the slab. The label confirmed what he had hoped: 1990 Lincoln cent, reverse die overpolished, missing design elements, high MS condition. He turned the slab over and over in the light, admiring the strange, ghostly way the memorial seemed to fade into the fields of the coin. He couldn't help but smile at how such a small, overlooked detail from the mint's routine maintenance had created a coin unlike any other. The whispers of his discovery began to spread beyond the forums. Word reached dealers, then auction houses, and soon he was fielding offers from collectors who wanted the coin for their own. At first, he refused them all, wanting to hold on to what felt like a once-in-a-lifetime find. But the offers grew more generous with each passing month, as others realized just how scarce and visually striking this error was. He watched with fascination as the market evolved. Similar coins, though not quite as clean or sharp as his, began appearing at auctions with steadily climbing estimates. Collectors who once ignored modern pennies now clamored for these rare mistakes. He saw listings for overpolished die errors from earlier years fetch surprising amounts, and 1990 specimens, when they could even be found, drew fierce competition. When the time finally felt right, he consigned his coin to a major auction house. They advertised it as one of the finest known examples of the 1990 overpolished die penny, and anticipation built as the date of the auction approached. When the day finally came, he sat in the back of the room, heart racing as the auctioneer introduced the lot. Bids flew in quickly at first, then slowed as the numbers rose higher, each bidder testing the resolve of the others. Finally, the gavel fell, and the final price was announced. The 1990 US 1-cent penny, once just another coin in a coffee can, had sold for between $38,000 and $110,000. By 1999, the Lincoln cent had already been a mainstay of American pockets for 90 years. Its iconic design, Abraham Lincoln's solemn profile on the front and the stately Lincoln Memorial on the back, remained unchanged as the mint produced billions more of these humble copper-plated zinc coins. In that final year of the century, presses across the United States clattered day and night, spitting out pennies at an astonishing pace. For most, it was a forgettable, ordinary issue. Yet buried somewhere in that river of metal, an unnoticed mistake made its way through, destined to quietly change hands for years before anyone realized what it truly was. One Saturday morning, a young collector shuffled through loose change at his kitchen counter, a habit he'd kept since childhood. He was no stranger to searching rolls of coins from the bank, but this was just a lazy weekend with no particular expectations. As usual, most of what he saw was unremarkable, shiny but common modern cents, a few dull nickels, the occasional wheat penny worth setting aside. Then, just as he was about to move on to another roll, his eyes caught something strange. It was a 1999 penny, at first glance nothing out of the ordinary. But it glimmered a little differently under the light. The fields were unusually smooth, almost proof-like, yet it came from a regular circulation roll. More striking still, when he flipped the coin to examine the reverse, his breath caught. The Lincoln Memorial looked off. Entire portions of the intricate detail were missing. The steps at the base faded almost completely into the blank field. The columns were faint, hazy, and the tiny designer's initials on the right side seemed nearly invisible. He froze, holding it closer, turning it over and over in his fingers. His first thought was damage, maybe it had been worn down in someone's pocket or scuffed against concrete. But no, the surfaces were too clean, the luster too sharp. This wasn't wear. This was something else entirely. His curiosity piqued, he grabbed his loupe and peered closer. The telltale signs began to emerge. The detail hadn't been obliterated by circulation, it had never been there to begin with. The coin had been struck from a die that was clearly overpolished. Somewhere in the mint's rush to keep production moving, a worn die had been polished too aggressively, erasing fine details before it went back into service. And here it was, preserved on this penny, waiting patiently to be discovered. He set the coin aside with care, hardly believing what he held in his hand. He had heard whispers of similar errors on other dates, coins where the mint's routine maintenance had gone a little too far, creating these strange ghost-like designs. But he couldn't remember ever seeing one on a 1999 cent before. That night, he posted clear photos of the coin on an online message board for error collectors. Replies trickled in throughout the evening, first cautious questions, then genuine excitement. One collector noted that 1999 was a particularly busy year at the mint, with enormous production quotas and little time for quality control. Another pointed out that errors from this year were scarce, especially ones in such pristine condition. By the next morning, his inbox was full of messages asking if he would consider selling. For the first time, he began researching past sales, combing through auction records, reading what little documentation existed about late-century die polishing mistakes. A pattern began to emerge. Other overpolished die errors from earlier decades had fetched respectable sums at auction, but examples from the late 1990s were nearly unheard of. That rarity only added to the coin's mystique that he decided to send it to a professional grading service for authentication and encapsulation. The weeks of waiting tested his patience, each day dragging a little longer as he imagined what the result might be. When the package finally arrived, he tore into it eagerly, heart pounding as he read the label. There it was in black and white, 1999 Lincoln Cent, reverse overpolished die, MS grade, and certified as a genuine mint error. The slabbed coin sat in his palm like a secret finally revealed. He tilted it back and forth, marveling at how the memorial seemed to dissolve into nothing at certain angles, almost as if Lincoln's monument had been swallowed by time. Word of his find began to spread through the community. Dealers and collectors reached out with offers, some polite, others insistent. At first, he resisted selling, determined to keep it in his collection as a testament to what careful eyes and a little luck could uncover. But the offers kept rising, and with each passing month, more collectors seemed to wake up to the peculiar charm of these overpolished die errors. That he tracked the market closely, watching as similar pieces, though often less sharp, less dramatic than his, surfaced in small auctions and private sales. Prices climbed, then plateaued, then climbed again, each time pulling his own coin's value higher with them. At coin shows, he'd spot dealers quietly discussing overpolished die cents, noting how their scarcity in later dates like 1999 kept demand strong and competitive. Finally, after much consideration, he consigned the coin to a major auction house known for handling rare mint errors. The catalog listing was modest yet intriguing, and when the day of the sale arrived, he stood in the back of the crowded room, watching closely as bidding began. At first, the bids came in quickly, climbing past what he'd imagined it might bring. Then, as the numbers rose higher, the pace slowed, just enough to build tension, before a final flurry of competition broke out between two determined collectors. The auctioneer's gavel fell at last, and the final price was announced, the 1999 US 1-cent penny, once just another unnoticed coin among billions, had sold for between $33,000 and $99,000. The turn of the millennium brought a sense of anticipation across the United States, even to the quiet hum of the nation's mints. In the year 2000, the Lincoln Cent still carried its familiar design, Abraham Lincoln's stately profile on the obverse and the Lincoln Memorial etched on the reverse. Millions of coins poured out of Philadelphia and Denver, a flood of copper-plated zinc pieces meant to keep commerce moving without interruption. There was no ceremony or fanfare for these ordinary pennies, no hint in the air that something extraordinary was slipping through unnoticed on the production floor. It was more than a decade later when a seasoned collector sat at his desk, sorting through a box of loose change he'd acquired at a flea market. The lot was messy, coffee cans full of dull nickels, battered dimes, and countless pennies in every shade from bright red to near black. He didn't expect much. A few wheat cents, maybe a steel cent if luck was on his side. Still, he worked methodically, enjoying the ritual. As his fingers sifted through the pile, he spotted a penny that looked unusually fresh for its age. Its date read 2000, nothing special there. But the way it caught the light was strange. He tilted it closer, narrowing his eyes at the reverse. The Lincoln Memorial was incomplete. At first glance, it seemed faint, but not from where. The surfaces were sharp, the fields reflective, and yet entire portions of the memorial's steps and columns had simply vanished. He paused, examining it under his loupe. The steps at the base blurred into the fields, and the right side of the building seemed to dissolve into nothing. Even the tiny FG initials of the designer were barely visible. He flipped it over and back again, running a thumb along the crisp edge. This wasn't damage. There were no gouges, no signs of harsh cleaning or abrasion. This coin had been born this way. His pulse quickened. He'd seen this before, in books and at shows, but never in person. Overpolished die errors had long fascinated him, the result of a mint technician's overzealous maintenance, polishing a worn die so aggressively that details of the design were wiped away. These coins, still sharp and brilliant, bore the ghostly scars of that mistake. What struck him most was the date. He'd seen overpolished Lincoln Memorial cents from earlier decades fetch good prices at auction, but never one from the year 2000. The idea that an error from the very first year of the new millennium existed, and that he might have it right there in his hand, made his breath catch. That he set it aside carefully and continued through the pile, though his thoughts kept returning to that penny. Later that evening, he took high-resolution photos and shared them with an online forum of fellow error collectors. Replies trickled in overnight. Some were skeptical at first, but others grew excited as they studied the images. The consensus began to form: it looked authentic. And more importantly, they couldn't recall seeing another documented 2000 cent with such a dramatic overpolished reverse. The weeks that followed were a blur of research. He dug through auction archives and error coin registries, hunting for any mention of a similar piece. Listings for overpolished memorial cents appeared sporadically, one from the 1980s, a few from the 1990s, but nothing quite matched what he held. If others existed, they were few and far between. He sent the coin to a top-tier grading service, anxious to see if they would confirm what he already knew. When the slab finally arrived in the mail, he opened it with trembling hands. There it was, certified and encapsulated, 2000 Lincoln cent, reverse overpolished die, mint state, mint error. The label validated his find. Word began to spread among collectors. At first it was just quiet whispers at local shows. Dealers who'd never paid much attention to minor die polishing errors began to ask about this one, intrigued by its unusual date and sharp condition. Before long, others started scouring rolls and bags, hoping to find another example, but none surfaced. That only heightened interest in his coin that he resisted the first few offers that came his way. Part of him wanted to keep it, to hold on to the thrill of discovery and the bragging rights of having found a one-of-a-kind error. But curiosity got the better of him, and he started watching sales of similar errors more closely. Prices for overpolished cents, once a quiet niche, were climbing steadily as collectors grew more aware of their rarity and appeal. At a major show later that year, a dealer approached him with a serious offer, and it was clear the market had shifted. Overpolished memorial cents from earlier years were already commanding premiums, and his coin's date and quality gave it an added mystique. He knew then it was time that he consigned it to a prominent auction house that specialized in rare errors. The catalog write-up was understated but tantalizing, describing the missing details, the brilliant surfaces, the eerie ghost-like memorial on the reverse. On the night of the sale, he stood near the back of the room, heart hammering in his chest as the bidding began. At first, the numbers climbed briskly, then slowed, then surged again as two determined collectors vied for it. The auctioneer's voice rose with each increment. Finally, the hammer fell, and the final price was called out to the hushed crowd. The 2000 US 1-cent penny, a quiet mistake in a year of billions, had realized between $30,000 and $90,000.